gracious God, come to us and break our hearts open with love of you. Amen. So right off the bat, I need you to pull out a pen or a pencil, and on the back of your service sheet or on a blank page in your service sheet, there will be an exercise for us. You can work your fingers to the bone, and this has not one influence upon the God whose love and devotion to you has been given. This may or may not be a truth across all boundaries, but it is certainly a truth in our relationship with God. You can work your fingers to the bone, and this has not one influence upon the God whose love and devotion to you has been given. The whole concept of being justified by faith and not by works speaks to this very idea that Paul is so eloquently confirming for us in this passage in his letter to the church in Rome. Now, that you accept and believe in God's love is and will be the final matter, and the one that as humans we struggle with the most. For the world is telling us differently. The world is telling us that our worth is measured by our productivity. And our productivity is being measured by its extrinsic value. Extrinsic values are established by man. They are enforced by man, and they are judged by man. And we have managed to overlay this idea of worth onto God. This is not, however, the lesson of our faith. And in this passage from Paul to the faithful in Rome, we hear clearly Paul's message that upends and overturns the message of a world that has taken God and made use of this deity in a way that satisfies man's needs and ignores God. Paul is here more than anywhere else in his many letters channeling Jesus' message of challenge to a world that has lost its way. This passage from Romans I see vividly in a circle, and here's where you're going to want to use your pen and a blank piece of paper. A circle. You know, just a regular circle. Doesn't have to be perfect. That circle begins and ends in various places for each of us. Where we enter it, at which point we will dwell or linger more than at other points, and how it is or where it is, or if even we're able to move on and move around the circle. And I promise you I'm going to give you points for that circle. But first, we're going to put something in the center of the circle. At the center of all is the peace of God which passes all understanding. At the center of all is the peace of God which passes all understanding. This is the abiding relationship of such an intimacy with God that the circle of our lives, which contain the hardships and the difficulties of all humanity, these fade in comparison to the light of God's love and God's compassion. It is here that we find ourselves so integrated with the grace of God, that grace that compels us to that stillness of peace. that assurance of love. This is where we abide in the intrinsic value of who we are, of our lives, at its very core. So when you make that circle, put peace in the middle. And then around the perimeter of that circle, we will link the following terms. Suffering. Isn't that a fun place to start? The word suffering. For Paul says, suffering produces endurance. Now, everyone suffers. It is how we deal with that suffering that marks us. How is it we endure that suffering? Are we blaming others? Are we resentful? Are we brooding about it? Perhaps we are perplexed by it. Are we angry? Do we learn? Do we learn from our suffering? And suffering moves us into endurance. Put that down. You're going to want to make an arrow from suffering to endurance. Endurance is a funny little word. Are we meant to endure in silence that which we suffer? Do we have a great teacher who has shown us how to suffer? Does this mean that there is a wrong way and a right way to suffer? Now, I'd like you to make another arrow as you're moving around the circle. So we've got suffering and we've got endurance, and now I want you to put the word character. Because Paul says endurance produces character. In some translations, the word fortitude is used instead of endurance. And I wonder if we look at the term endurance, does using the word fortitude somehow feel different or feel better? If suffering produces fortitude, does that make us feel better? What about if we use the word perseverance instead? Perhaps persistence. That might be a good one for most of us. How about determination? We like that word. These are all synonymous with the term of endurance. And what kind of character are we forming out of this endurance? What kind of character? For that's the next word that Paul says. Endurance produces character, right? So character is further around that circle. And what he says about character is that character produces hope. Character produces hope. Now, this is where I divert just slightly. As many of you know, I was active duty military for a number of years. And so when I think of the word character, I immediately recall being in the Army, especially in basic training, which is always a lot of fun. For throughout my time on active duty, every time we were ordered to perform a task, especially a task that seemed really, well, stupid, we were told we were ordered to do this because it produces character. I kid you not, exact words of most of the Army officers that I had to follow the orders of. And so, like, for example, when I was stationed at Fort Benning in Georgia, we had to fill up sandbags. So we'd fill up the sandbags in this spot, and then we'd have to take the sandbags over there for no apparent reason. And then we'd have to bring the sandbags back, again for no apparent reason. Of course, we all know the reason for this. We were being asked to follow orders. But what they always said, when some of us who never got smart enough to stop asking a rational question of why, was because it builds character. It builds character. Well, I suspect it does build character, doesn't it? At some point, I got real tired and thought I had enough character, in which case I began to do push-ups. I did a lot of push-ups. Now, most of us have lived longer than 4 days. Well, maybe not the littlest one in the audience. And we know there are many, many great quotes about character. I want to share just two. I know for a fact you'll recognize the first quote. I have a dream. I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. Martin Luther King, Jr. Religion is meant to teach us true spiritual human character. It is meant for self-transformation. It is meant to transform anxiety into peace, arrogance into humility, envy into compassion, to awaken the pure soul in man and his love for the source, which is God. Radhanath Swami. There are so many quotes about character that we can read. Now, what I may or may not have understood during my young years, being challenged as an Army soldier, I certainly understood during the challenges of living life. How it is I respond to the tragedies of my own life determine the core of my own character. Is that character, at its core, living in God? Am I learning from my suffering? What am I learning from that suffering? Am I tireless in my search forward? And yet, am I remain grounded in God? And does this sustain me? Does this bring me hope? For hope is the next place on the circle. For Paul says, character produces hope, and hope lives in God. And hope does not disappoint. It is at the point of hope that we enter into the circle where we reside with God. Where God is, there is always hope. Note that hope lives up on the circle, up with humanity, up with suffering, up with perseverance and endurance, up with character. Hope lives up in the circle. But it is also the place where we find transcendence, where I think we find that thin place between God and humanity. A long time ago, when I was experiencing a personal tragedy that would alter my life forever, a woman I worked with gave me a Bible. It was the Year Bible, in which all the scriptures, Old and New Testaments, were divided into equal parts and laid out in daily readings. On the inside cover of this Bible, she had written this passage from Romans, and she had linked these words in that circle with God in the middle. Now, not only have I never forgotten, but I still have that Bible. And she did this for me at a time of her own personal tragedy. A few weeks before she gave this gift to me, she had just returned to work after burying her daughter and her daughter's entire family who had been killed in a tragic airplane crash. Her son-in-law was piloting that small plane and returning them all home from a visit to visit her. Dead were her daughter, her son-in-law, and their 2 kids, both under the age of 12. Not only is this time etched into my memory, the conversation that she and I had about the reading from Romans 5 remains for me a constant guide and reminder. A reminder to me that when I keep God central in my life, my life remains grounded in what is important. No matter how often I may go up into that circle of suffering and endurance, of character building, no matter how often I find my life challenged or even downright insufferable, it is keeping God central that keeps me grounded. Even when I wander from that central place, that place of peace, of which I do wander, I know that it is my hope. It is my hope in God's love and God's peace that passes all understanding that will bring me back to where it is I live, which is in God's love. Amen.